Achieving the correct wrist hinge in the golf swing can seem like searching for that elusive needle in a haystack for many of you. It may look like you can do whatever you want with the wrist because there's lots of different looking golf swings out there. But the truth is, if you really want to master contact, club face control, and improve your ball striking, getting the wrists right in the golf swing is absolutely essential. In this video today, I'm going to specifically discuss the proper wrist hinge in the backswing and how you can build that into your swing very quickly using a drill that's very straightforward, but like most good drills, very effective. I want to use the HackMotion wrist sensor to help you see some of these movements of the wrists and understand where they take place, where you're getting it wrong, and how we can overcome that. When we start at setup, I want you to take a look at how my wrist is conditioned, how it's set up. I have a very small amount of lead wrist extension. Extension is the cupping or the movement of the wrist in this direction where I get this angle in the back of my wrist. I have a small amount of extension in my lead wrist because of how I grip the club. That's pretty normal. That's quite standard if you have a fairly neutral grip. So that extension number sits around 13 degrees. And then in terms of the up and down movement of the wrist, upwards is called radial deviation, and the downward movement of the wrist is called ulnar deviation. When I set up to the ball, I have around 27, 28 degrees of ulnar deviation. Again, pretty standard. But that's not how my wrists are going to stay throughout the swing. If they did, I'd have almost no ability to create power. So we have to move our wrists in the swing to create speed. Otherwise, we just can't hit the ball far enough. But how you hinge and bend your wrists matters. Most of you are doing it wrong. It's costing you control, it's costing you distance, and it's costing you shots every time you play. Let's take a look at the difference in the wrist between setup and the top of the swing. I've already discussed how I've got this ulnar deviation. So that's this 28 degrees of, if you like, downward or uncocked wrist. If I kept 27, 28, 29 degrees of ulnar deviation and kept swinging back, keeping the same amount of ulnar deviation, this is as far back as I could go. This is no wrist hinge, literally. I haven't hinged my wrists at all. And we know that that would be completely wrong. That would look somewhat ridiculous. I've got a maximum swing length about this far back. So we know that I need to start adding some radial. I've got to start hinging my wrist, as I said, to create power. But it's important I do it in a very specific way. Equally with this extension of my lead wrist at setup, as I swing to the top, I don't keep that extension. That extension's disappeared. I now have a very flat lead wrist where that number is slightly flexed now, if anything. So I'm making these wrist movements very subtly throughout the backswing. I'm not thinking about them consciously in my swing anymore, but you may well need to, and that's where some of the problems arise. That's a lot to think about in a very short space of time. Let me share with you a drill that helps you to get all of these wrist alignments locked in before you've even started to swing the club back. So if I go ahead and take this club to the top, let's check out those numbers a couple more times. The 6 degrees of flexion basically means my wrist is pretty flat. That's a good thing. And I've got 14, 15 degrees of radial deviation. That's this upward cocking. That's what most of you would understand as wrist hinge, the cocking of the wrists, the upward movement. So that was 6 degrees of flexion and 15 degrees of radial deviation. Let me now go to this preset position in the backswing. Okay, I'm going to set up with the shaft parallel to the ground and pointing more or less down my stance line or down my target line. If we look at the screen there, you'll see I've got 15 degrees of radial deviation. That was the same amount I'm going to have at the top. There you see that's 15 or 16, that's perfect. So the amount of radial deviation that I need, the amount of wrist hinge that I need, has already been built in to this particular drill. I've put it all in here at the setup. Equally, the flexion extension component this is reading 0 degrees of extension. That means my wrist is completely flat. Remember, it wasn't completely flat at setup. I had 11, 12 degrees of extension. As I rest the club here in this preset position, I've now got 0, 1 degree of flex, and I've got 14, 15 degrees of radial. To the top, it's the same. It's 2 degrees of flex and 14 degrees of radial. I can get the sense of building in the correct wrist movement just in this first piece of the swing, get my arms and wrists organized in such a way that from here, all I need to do is turn my shoulder down and under my chin, and I've completed the perfect backswing. So from the front view, just to demonstrate, I'm hinging the wrists. That's a broad term, as we know. Hinging the wrists can mean lots of different things. And for many of you, it will be chaotic. You won't know what you're doing. This is specific. You're taking the wrists to the point where the shaft's parallel to the ground. The butt end of the club effectively still sits over the ball. So if I was to put a ball in place here in front of me, I'm not moving the arms and the club away. Okay, I'm just setting the wrist where the butt end of the club still sits more or less on top of the golf ball. That's where I want you to be. Shaft, as I said, is parallel to the ground. And in terms of those wrist numbers, again, look, 4 degrees of flexion in the lead wrist. It's pretty much flat. And I've got 18 degrees of radial. Those numbers have hovered around that same window consistently. This wrist and arm structure that I'm building in here is the same wrist and arm structure that I want to have at the top. There's 2 degrees of extension and there's still 18 degrees of radial deviation. That's sufficient hinge to hit the ball far and to control your direction. So many of you get this wrong when you misinterpret wrist hinge. You get the radial or the cocking part of the wrists completely wrong, and that throws out the rest of the wrist angles, which ultimately loses club face control. Let me explain what I mean by that. If I was to go to the top and try to excessively hinge my wrists, maybe I'm trying to create excessive lag. I think I need to do that. I need to hinge my wrists to create more power. If I go to the top and hinge my wrists too much, those numbers are going to change dramatically. Yes, I've added radial, okay? I've gone from that 15, 16, 17, 18 degrees of radial deviation. Now that says 27, 28, 29. I can even take it further than that. I've added the wrist cock, no doubt. But take a look at that extension number. Have a look at the extension at the top of the swing. 37 degrees of lead wrist extension is directly responsible for spinning this club face open and into a wildly uncontrollable position. Once you do that, all bets are off. You may hit a good shot, 1 in 10, 1 in 20, but that will be the anomaly. That will be the rare one. From that poor wrist position at the top, where I've tried to extend my swing, I've tried to add more wrist hinge, I've done so in such a disastrous way that I've got no chance of controlling this club face. So being able to see those numbers and measure that is invaluable. There's nothing else that can show you that on the market that compares to how Hack Motion shows you what's going on at the wrist level. Being able to set the parameters down here at this checkpoint and then take that to the top is going to really help you to train good wrist hinge, the correct wrist hinge, which will lead to better golf. And a great benefit of the Hack Motion wrist sensor is being able to set the parameters for where you want the wrists to be. And this particular drill is a great example of how that can really help, because what we want to be able to do is to set the wrists for the drill correctly. You're going to get some sound here. You'll hear when my wrists hit this ideal spot. So I can set the range for where I need that extension and flexion or ulnar and radial to be, and I can get some feedback. I can also get some feedback, which is the sensor vibrates. So I also get the feeling on my wrists, or I get some feedback, which is not just the auditory feedback, but also I get a sense on my wrist of the sensor vibrating. And that's great if you don't want that loud noise playing when you're practicing at the driving range. But I'm going to use it for the purpose of this video so that you can see and hear when I'm in range. So I'm moving that wrist back. There's that little bit of flexion and that radial, that hinge, to a point where I'm comfortable with it. I've already explained how too much is bad. If I was to take this back and over hinge my wrists at this point, You hear how the noise has disappeared. That's too much wrist hinge. Equally, if I took it back with no wrist hinge, I'd get no feedback because this is incorrect, or the feedback I'd be getting would be, okay, no sound, this isn't where I need to be. So preset the wrist, and then can I keep it at the top? You heard that where I set it, and then take it to the top. Not quite in range there, just looking for it, there it is. Keep it, there we go. That was slower. There's a little bit more under control there. It's just beginning to get a sense of how those wrists feel as I continue to load in the backswing, and even as I start to come down in the downswing. So you can do slow swings, dry drills, just taking yourself through the paces, setting the wrist, trying to keep it in range as I go back. There we go. Coming down. That's going to be really good. Look how the wrists are still cocked. I've still got sufficient lag to be able to then deliver this club at impact. So helping you to see that the wrist movements in this middle part of the swing, the backswing and the downswing, can be quite similar. And you can set the range to help you train that. Then, of course, you can go ahead and hit shots. You can get feedback from the app as far as how you moved your wrist. I can set my wrists. I can go to the top. I can just do this exercise. And I can go ahead and hit balls, trying to keep that sensation. There we go. I'm going to hit from here. That's felt pretty good. Nice little draw. I'll take the wrist out of position so it's not making too much noise. And I can get the feedback there on how my wrists move, both in terms of the up and down nature of the radial and ulnar, and in terms of the flexion extension of this lead wrist. So there's some ways to understand the proper wrist hinge in the golf swing. Of course, if you don't have access to hack motion, that's fine. You can still utilize this drill. The position of the hands at the point in the swing here, where the shaft is parallel to the ground, okay? Keeping those wrists in that condition, you can hear that's in the perfect spot. It's very different to where I am at setup. I'm going to move the wrist, get the feedback where the lead wrist is flat and the trail wrist is bent back slightly. I'm adding this radial, this upward hinge. As I'm hinging upwards, I'm also flexing the wrist. There's my checkpoint, all the way to the top and through. Train like that and you'll be training for the perfect wrist hinge mechanics. I hope you found the information in that video useful, with a drill that you can take to the range or even use at home, just doing dry exercises, practicing that preset position and then taking the club to the top. Whatever you found from today's video, it's essential to understand that club face control really is wrist control. And if you want to improve your wrist mechanics, you should check out the link down in the description for more videos that will help you to train your wrists.